Welcome back to another Monster Monday, a series where I draw a creature from D&D and I talk about its lore and its history and what it's like to fight as well. You guys have been very generous with your requests for creatures that you'd like to see me draw and talk about. And so this one actually comes from the YouTube comments. This is from Moses Wayde, and I was initially very worried about how to pronounce the creature that he's requested. Initially thought it looked a little bit like Shoryuken from Street Fighter, get some Ryu or Ken kind of action going on here. Sahuagin was what I was going to go with, but thankfully the Forgotten Realms wiki put me out of my misery. Writing it down nice and easily for me was Sahuagin. Kind of think because they're aquatic, maybe get the in the back there, kind of like up here in Scotland. You know, if you're going to visit Nessie, you wouldn't call that Loch Ness, you'd call that Loch Ness in the back. So Sahuagin sounds pretty good to me. Let's go with that. So what are they, for a start? Well, they are fish people, of which there is absolutely no shortage in D&D. They're not the merfolk, they're not tritons, they're not the kuotoa, they're not sea elves or water genasi. There are enough fish kind of people in D&D for you to have campaigns entirely underwater, which is now flowing through my brain, and I'm wondering how I can fit an entire aquatic campaign into my D&D campaign that I'm writing next, because everybody loves water combat, clearly. And obviously the water temples in the Zelda games are absolutely the most fun ones, right? No, but it could be really good. It could be really good. I'll have a think about it and let you guys know if I come up with a good campaign set underwater. Have you guys ever done that? Let me know in the comments if you have ever come up with an entirely aquatic campaign or underwater questline. But in D&D, there is largely one man to thank for the entirety of the underwater content that you will experience. All the monsters, creatures, all that good stuff. And it's not Gary Gygax, although I'm sure he definitely was involved. Stephen R. Marsh is the man that we need to thank for most of our aquatic content in D&D. When he was in school with Sandy Peterson. I don't know if any of you have played the Call of Cthulhu RPG, but if you have, then that was created by Sandy Peterson. And Stephen R. Marsh was one of his friends. Around the time that D&D first came out, Stephen Marsh borrowed Sandy Peterson's freshly released edition of D&D, and he loved it so much that he started corresponding with Gary Gygax. The two of them developed a little bit of a friendship, and Gary loved Marsh's version of the elemental plane of water in particular, and all the many aquatic creatures that came with it. And eventually, Gary decided to publish an awful lot of these in what become AD&D, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. And a lot of the creatures that were presented there have survived up until today. So Stephen Marsh, who is now a lawyer, is the person that we have to thank for a lot of our water-based content in D&D, even up until 5th edition, including Sahuagin. Now, if you had as much trouble as I did trying to pronounce these initially, then you might know them by a different name, which is sea devils. They're often called sea devils. And these aquatic hunters of the deep waters are known for their viciousness and for their bloodthirsty hatred. They believe themselves to be masters of the oceans, and they rule over it with tireless warmongering. It's also said that they search almost every crevice and ravine, every shipwreck, any sunken cave or ancient drowned city for intruders in what they believe to be their realm. They believe that they have unprecedented rights to all things aquatic. They think they should rule the world of the sea. But they don't do it just to kick out intruders. These guys are evil alignment. They're not just doing it because they feel like they're being invaded. They're not trying to protect themselves. They also hunt for sport and pleasure as much as for food or for security. And they hate a lot of creatures, anything that wanders into their sea realm that shouldn't be there. But the creature that they hate more than anything else are the sea elves. Now, sea elves are in a lot of editions of D&D. At the time of writing this, I don't actually think that they're playable in 5e. I mean, there's almost certainly a homebrew, but I don't think that they're in any of the books that I own, at least. Let me know if they are in one of the expanded books. You guys have got your hands on them. I know we have water genasi, we have the merfolk, we have the tritons, things like that. Playable tritons. Either way, if you've got sea elves, let me know. The Sahuagin absolutely hate sea elves with a passion. They believe them to be the only contenders who are staking their claim the Sea Devil's ocean. They believe that they are the only threat to their dominance over the entire ocean, and as a result, they prioritize them above all other things that they want to kill. But they're also tied to them intrinsically. We know that they can sometimes give birth to mutants. Mutation is not uncommon amongst the Sahuagin, but they can give birth to mutants that are called malenti. And this mutation only seems to happen if the Sahuagin live too close to sea elves, which shouldn't really surprise us. Again, like I say, mutation is fairly common among their people. The leaders of the Sahuagin, for example, are called barons, and they are not sort of elected or chosen, not a royal bloodline or anything like that. Any Sahuagin from any family or background can be a baron. It's just a very slim chance at birth that they will be born a mutant with 4 arms instead of 2, and they'll be absolutely enormous. In some settings, I think in Pathfinder, they also are born with jet black skin, if that's the case. But the Malenti are particularly unusual mutants, even for mutants, and that's saying something. They are born looking exactly like sea elves, which is super weird, because this isn't a transformation. They don't transform into sea elves over time, or they can't flip backwards and forwards. They're not shape changes. These creatures are born looking like sea elves, and they will die looking like sea elves, having been born of an entirely different species, supposedly. Now, Malenti use this to their advantage. They often infiltrate sea elf homes and things like that. I imagine if you homebrewed a Sahuagin race, you could play maybe one of these that's kind of split off from Sahuagin society. Just roll up a sea elf, and then make them a barbarian as well, to maybe account for their kind of bloodthirstiness and their shark-like nature, which I'll touch on in a bit. But these Malenti being born looking exactly like the natural enemy of the species that produced them is so unusual. It has to be magical, right? It can't be an evolutionary trait. Nothing acts like that. Even for something that's very mutation heavy. These are just humanoids. They're not elementals. They're not demons. They're not spirits. They are supposedly natural creatures. You don't see sharks that mutate to look exactly like dolphins, things like that. Very odd. So, I would go ahead and say that there's something else at work here. And my theory is that the Sahuagin have actually mutated and evolved from a common ancestor with elves, or that perhaps they've mutated from elves themselves. From the sea elves in particular, because we kind of have this idea that's prevalent in a lot of fantasy literature, a lot of high fantasy, thanks to Tolkien for the most part. Things like the bloodthirsty orcs evolving, or I suppose mutating really, from essentially tortured and mistreated elves, and they hate each other. They are polar opposites to each other, so maybe it's that kind of idea persisting through between the sea elves and the Sahuagin. It would explain their physique and their similarity to the elves. They also have very sort of human-like hands, despite being webbed, except for the Arans. They are, bipedal, 2-armed things, 1 head, 2 eyes. They have a nose in most sort of drawings. I mean, they look very human with sort of like a downturned mouth for the most part in the DMG. Just have a very shark-based feel about them according to their rules, which is why I'm drawing this one a bit more shark-like. That's just my personal preference. And there's other pieces of media that might kind of hint at this mutation. Sea devils, the other name for Sahuagin, are also the name of an old Doctor Who creature that are mutants. They are mutations of the subterranean reptile species, the Silurians. Vastra, the detective, a kind of reptile detective that kind of nod to Sherlock Holmes in Doctor Who. Her species apparently evolve into sea devils, or mutate into sea devils. But I actually feel there might be a more similar comparison in the monster that we covered in last Monster Monday, the Yuan Tai. To recap, for those who didn't watch it, the Yuan Tai are snake people that once were humans, very ancient ancestral humans. They prayed to serpent gods and eventually cast off their humanity in exchange for becoming these kind of snake-human hybrids, this kind of mix. And we know the Sahuagin worship a shark god called Sekolah, Sekolah. Only female Sahuagin can channel the power of their god, and this puts them in a very influential place in Sahuagin society. It's very similar to the dark practices of the Yuan Tai, this kind of horrible cannibalistic practices that the Yuan Tai practice to shed their humanity. Sekolah really likes blood magic, and this is reflected in their species, their shark-like nature as well. But interestingly, female-only priests. We know that the Sea Elves are actually quite a patriarchal society. It's one of the few things we know about them very well. is that men seem to dominate their society. So putting a weird sort of timeline in my head, if they are so connected to the sea elves, maybe fed up with the rule of men, some female priests discovered a whispering god called Sekola, channeled its powers, and set about destroying and casting off the shackles of their oppressors in this ancient elven aquatic world, and gradually they were transformed. This moment being lost to the annals of time, but all is remembered is that the creatures that came out of these practices were forever transformed by their shark god, and still hated the beings that they came from. For what reason they may not know, there we go, could be that. But the sharkness has definitely left an imprint on the Sahuagin. They have incredible dark vision, just like the drow, it's up to 120 feet, although they don't have the downsides that the dark elves do. They don't have the sunlight vulnerability. Sharks also have this. They have a special piece of tissue just behind their retinas that reflect light back into it. And the explanation I imagine behind not having to deal with the sunlight sensitivity that drow do for having that amazing dark vision is that sharks can dilate their pupils just like humans do, which is very, very uncommon. Almost no fish can do that. Certainly not bony fish, which none of them can dilate their pupils. They're so used to whatever plateau, whatever level of water they live in. The Sahuagin can telepathically communicate with sharks within 120 feet of themselves. And it says that this is magical in the book. They can magically communicate with them. I like to think that this is in some way to do with using electrical or magical currents through the water. Sharks have these natural electromagnetic field receptors all over their heads, mostly concentrated on basically their nose, like little motion detecting canals, little tubes that go into their heads, a little bit like pores on the front of their noses. So maybe the Sahuagin release magical information into the water, and these vibrations are carried to nearby sharks, telling them exactly what they want to do. Now, most iconically, after watching the Jaws films, we all know sharks love a good blood frenzy, and that is carried over into the Sahuagin as well. The Sahuagin have an ability called Blood Frenzy. They gain advantage on melee attacks against creatures that aren't at full HP. So naturally, if you're bleeding underwater, they're going to target you straight away. Sharks have an incredibly keen sense of smell. Little nostrils can detect a drop of blood in however much water. The myth seems to grow larger and smaller every year. A couple of miles they can detect a drop of blood in some years. Either way, it's very, very precise. They can detect a very small amount of blood in a very large amount of water. They have two nostrils at the front of their nose, which unlike us aren't used for breathing. They use their gills exclusively to breathe, but their nostrils are just used for sensing smells. So they become incredibly refined in this. They're much better at smelling things than we are. Nostrils are very small as well. They're designed for just the purpose of detecting blood, really. And what this does is that it means over time they have evolved the ability to have very strong sort of directional sense of smell. Their electroreceptors will pick up on movement, nostrils will tell them where something's bleeding, and their minds will quickly work out that something bleeding is in a certain direction, and that means prey. Sharks don't really lose their minds during a feeding frenzy, during this blood frenzy, which is actually reflected in the Sahuagin blood frenzy. I was kind of surprised by this, because with the whole gaining advantage on attacks thing, I would have thought, barbarian, reckless attack, you gain advantage because you are in a frenzy, a blood frenzy, and things have advantage to attack you. But creators of D&D have thought of this. Sharks are keep a very cool and calm head when they're in what looks like a frenzy to us. Sharks basically get really excited by distressed prey, not necessarily the blood. Their nostrils tell them exactly where the blood is, what direction it's in, to track prey, but that's not the thing that really makes them ultra excited. This tells them where to go. A sign outside a shop saying fresh meat over here. Distressed prey moves a lot more, and it sets off more of these electromagnetic receptors in their heads and basically advertise that something is very close to death. If you're panicking, you're flailing a lot more in the water, causing a lot more ripples and fluctuations in the water, so the sharks are going to prioritize that target. Sharks are more often than not solitary hunters. They don't want to fight for their food because, if you're all alone and something's going to fight back, it's going to cost a lot more energy to fight something and wither it down. But if something's already distressed, if you're already getting these signs of distress, maybe it's wounded already, it's bleeding, what have you, you can have a much easier time, just bite it a couple of times or thrash around a bit with it, Eventually they'll get weak and die. You've cost almost no energy to yourself, but you've gained a full meal. They'll always go for a wounded target if they can. They kind of go into a frenzy when a lot of sharks turn up. They gang up all on one target that looks like it's very stressed, and because they're not necessarily used to hunting in packs, they all really want to get a bite in, basically. Because they never really stop feeling hungry. They apparently don't really feel full in the same way that we do. We get kind of like a nice triggered response to our brains saying, cool, you've had enough food for now. But sharks don't really get that in the same way. Maybe they get a little bit desperate when they see a lot of other sharks around competing for the same food source. They get a little bit hangry. They go into this frenzy. But, as I said, this is not a barbarian's reckless attack, and that's reflected in the Sahuagin because sharks are said to observe strict pecking orders. Amidst what looks like chaos to us in this blood frenzy, they'll always allow more important sharks, sort of like apex predators, the kind of alphas in their group, the big uns, to get priority, to get their bites in before they take a chance. Everyone wants a piece, but they'll kind of organize themselves even though it looks like a lot of thrashing around to us. An interesting encounter idea, therefore, might be to change the threat from one person to another. If you're fighting a lot of Sahuagin, maybe they can detect with these motion receptors whoever's been moving the most. Maybe someone moves their full movement or dashes, they become the target of all the Sahuagin in 120 feet. This kind of telepathic area for them. Their electroreceptors go crazy when they feel a lot of movement. A really interesting encounter idea to see if you can solve a fight by using very little movement. Or maybe the tank of the group could try and kite a few Sahuagin by running really fast and waving their arms around a lot. Maybe kiting them into some traps left by your ranger or your rogue. Who knows? Could be a really interesting encounter. But otherwise, the Sahuagin come in 3 different forms. We have the standard one, the one that I'm drawing here. Their challenge rating 1/2. They only have their natural armor, their skin armor, although they're often depicted wearing a lot of kind of aquatic gear, lots of shells, lots of seaweed, things like that. Lots of kelp, just like their sea elf, probably headcanon cousins. But they also get multi-attacks. They get 2 attacks per turn, including a bite and 1 with their weapons. The priestesses are challenge rating 2. They come with all the same stuff. They also can cast a lot of magic. And the barons are challenge rating 5. They have really tough armor. They have a chest plate that gives them a much higher AC. And of course, with all those many arms, they also get 3 attacks rather than 2. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed learning about and watching me draw the Sahuagin, the sea devils. I really love drawing this one. It was fascinating to talk a little bit about sharks. They're really interesting creatures. So thank you very much for your suggestions. If you have any other suggestions, make sure to leave them in the comments below or on Facebook or Twitter. There are links in the description section. And as a channel, we're still growing. So if you want to help us out, make sure to like this video, maybe favorite it, and share it with someone who you think might enjoy this as well. And until next time, I'll see you later.